When Carl Jung began studying the strange illustrations tucked into old alchemical manuscripts, one shape appeared so consistently across so many different centuries and countries that he could not dismiss it as mere decoration. It was the circle. Sometimes it appeared as a simple round vessel in which the alchemists carried out their work. Sometimes it appeared as an egg, sometimes as a sphere containing the whole world in miniature, sometimes as a perfectly round stone that the alchemists claimed was the final goal of their entire labor. They called this ideal shape the rotundum, the round thing, and they insisted that whatever substance they were finally seeking had to take this particular form. Not square, not angular, not scattered into separate pieces. Round, complete, and without any beginning or end. Jung found this obsession with roundness far too consistent to be accidental, and the deeper he studied the reasoning behind it, the more he became convinced that the alchemists had stumbled, through their strange chemical experiments, onto one of the most fundamental patterns the human mind naturally produces when it tries to picture its own completeness. He began collecting drawings made by his patients, images they had produced spontaneously in dreams or in waking fantasy, often with no knowledge of alchemy or any interest in symbolism at all. And he noticed something remarkable. Whenever a person's inner life seemed to be moving toward a genuine sense of balance and wholeness, whenever the scattered and conflicting parts of their personality seemed to be settling into something more integrated and complete, images of circles began appearing in their dreams and drawings almost automatically. Sometimes these images were elaborate, divided into 4 equal sections like a wheel, sometimes decorated with intricate patterns radiating outward from a still center, but the underlying shape was consistently the same. This was not something Jung had suggested to his patients or encouraged them to draw. It emerged on its own from the depths of the unconscious mind, exactly the way the old alchemists insisted their round substance had to be discovered rather than manufactured. Jung concluded that the human mind possesses a kind of built-in blueprint for its own wholeness, and that this blueprint naturally expresses itself through the image of the circle whenever a person is genuinely moving toward greater psychological integration. He began referring to these circular images by a Sanskrit word borrowed from Eastern religious art, calling them mandalas, but the underlying idea was already fully present in the old alchemical obsession with the rotundum centuries before he ever encountered the Eastern tradition. Why a circle specifically, rather than any other shape, is worth thinking about carefully, because the choice was never arbitrary. A circle has no corners, no sharp edges where one part violently contradicts another. Every point along its circumference is equally distant from the center, equally important, equally part of the whole. There is no favorite side and no rejected side. Compare this to how most people actually experience their own personality before any real inner work has been done. Certain qualities are proudly displayed while others are hidden away in shame. Certain memories are cherished while others are pushed as far from consciousness as possible. Certain parts of the self are allowed to speak while other parts are silenced, denied, or projected outward onto other people. This is a fragmented and lopsided way of being a person, and it produces exactly the kind of jagged, unbalanced inner shape that a square or an irregular figure would represent far more accurately than a circle ever could. The alchemists believed that the entire purpose of their laborious work was to take exactly this kind of scattered, contradictory raw material, and gradually, through patient and repeated procedures, bring it into the balanced, symmetrical shape of the rotundum. Nothing about this transformation was quick or easy in their accounts. The raw material had to be dissolved, separated, purified, and recombined many times over before it finally settled into its round and complete form. Jung saw this same pattern in the psychological work he did with his patients over years and sometimes decades of treatment. A person does not simply decide one afternoon to become whole and immediately achieve it. The scattered and contradictory parts of a personality have to be discovered one at a time, often painfully, and then slowly, patiently brought into relationship with one another, examined, understood, and finally accepted as legitimate parts of a single larger whole, rather than enemies to be defeated or exiled forever. There is a particular quality of the circle that Jung found especially significant, and it concerns the relationship between the center and the edge. In a genuine mandala, whether drawn by a medieval alchemist or by a modern patient going through analysis, there is almost always some kind of meaningful center point, sometimes a flower, sometimes a small figure, sometimes simply a point of light or color from which everything else in the image seems to radiate outward. Jung came to believe that this center represents something distinct from the ordinary conscious personality, something he eventually called the self, a deeper organizing center of the whole psyche that includes but is not identical to the everyday sense of I that a person normally identifies with. The ordinary ego, the part of you that plans your day and makes your decisions and worries about your reputation, is not actually the center of the circle in this deeper sense. It is more like a single point, somewhere along the circumference, important but not the whole story. The true center, the self, is something both more inclusive and more mysterious, something a person can sense and move toward, but never fully grasp or control the way the ego likes to imagine it controls everything else in a life. This distinction matters enormously for how a person understands their own search for wholeness. If you assume that the ordinary conscious mind, the part of you that argues and plans and judges, is already the true center of your being, then any effort at self-improvement becomes simply an attempt to make that part stronger, louder, and more dominant over everything else. But if the alchemists and Jung were right that the true center lies somewhere deeper, somewhere that includes the unconscious as much as the conscious mind, the dark as much as the light, the qualities you have rejected as much as the ones you proudly display, then the search for wholeness looks very different. It becomes less about the ego seizing total control and more about the ego learning to take its proper place as one part, however important, of a much larger circle that it can serve and represent, but never fully rule. Think of your own life and ask honestly whether it currently feels more like a jagged, contradictory shape, certain parts proudly displayed while others are hidden in shame or exiled into denial, or whether it feels more like a circle, where even the difficult and unwanted parts of yourself have at least been acknowledged as belonging somewhere within the larger whole. Nobody achieves a perfect circle, and the alchemists themselves knew this, since their own accounts are full of failed attempts and years of frustrating labor before anything resembling the round and complete substance ever appeared. But simply knowing that this shape exists as a natural goal the human mind reaches for on its own can change how you relate to the scattered, unfinished feeling of an ordinary life still very much in progress. If you have ever drawn, dreamed of, or simply imagined a circle or a mandala-like shape during a period when you were working through something difficult in your own life, write below the single word for what that image seemed to be gathering together. Naming even one piece of your own circle is often the beginning of sensing the larger wholeness the old alchemists spent their lives trying to bring into visible form. Because the perfectly round stone those old workers searched for in their smoking laboratories was never really a mineral at all. It was the oldest picture the human mind has ever produced of its own hidden completeness, waiting patiently, the alchemists believed, to be gathered together out of all our scattered and contradictory pieces.